Welcome, everyone. So grateful to have you all joining us for our first safety conference, our interprofessional mini conference, hopefully the first of many more interprofessional conferences and professional development that we are working on over the course of the next year as part of our commitment to safety, as part of our commitment to protecting the public. So we are grateful to have all of you here. We're going to begin with a land acknowledgement. Please join me in the chat and acknowledge the Indigenous name of where you are joining us from. We like the map that is placenames.mapdev.ca because it's interactive. It allows you to zero in on the specific place where you are joining us from, and it also helps with how to pronounce it. If you are able to just take this moment first, though, and connect to the land so that we can be speaking from a place of gratitude. Perhaps close your eyes and imagine a place on this beautiful land where we are, if you are joining us from Mi'kma'ki, or if you are joining us from elsewhere on Turtle Island or beyond. Just take a moment to think of a spot where you feel especially connected and grateful. Perhaps it's the beach, perhaps it's a hiking trail, perhaps it's a park, perhaps it's your garden. But just take a moment to close your eyes and connect to that. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Unama'ki, which is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. They remain active to this day. Let us take this time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers commits to translating this acknowledgement into action by seeking to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, especially those regarding education. We commit to doing what we can to becoming better treaty partners. We commit to learning and to unlearning. We are all treaty people. And when we acknowledge the land, we must also begin to acknowledge the wisdom of this planet and align ourselves with its truths. We commit to using our professional development to both learn and to unlearn so that we can ensure safer social work practice and a more just world for all people. We are grateful for the new Canadian Association of Social Work Code of Ethics that we are in the middle of gathering feedback on, and that is requiring us to shift from the illusion of neutrality to actively becoming anti-racist and fighting against racism and all intersectional prejudice that is part of colonization. We recognize that neutrality in a system that is designed by bias and colonial goals, neutrality is actually complicity. And therefore, we are embracing our ethical mandate that is part of our Truth and Reconciliation commitment to shift to a non-neutral stance as part of our commitment to safety. Decolonizing ourselves and our practice means recognizing the ways in which we are each impacted by the colonial system in which we all participate, and from which those of us of settler descent continue to benefit. You can see here this intersectional wheel. I want to take this moment of gratitude to recognize Kimberly Crenshaw, who first developed the concept of intersectionality as an African-American feminist scholar. Each of us, depending upon our social location and intersectional positionality, are uniquely oppressed. For example, those of us of African descent were dispossessed and uprooted from their land and brought to Turtle Island against their will. Let us take this moment to reflect upon the unique impact of colonization upon each of us and upon our practice. How can we translate this awareness into a commitment to safer social work practice and safer practice for all people? Let us take this moment to pause in gratitude for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this sacred work. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we must all begin to learn. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Let us take this deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. Let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the racism, queerphobia, and unconscious bias that is everywhere, inside and out. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. Walalu. Thank you all. This is our schedule for today. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about decolonizing our understanding of safety. Then Alec is going to be speaking at 11 about developing a safety registry. We are going to have a break from 12 to 1. And then at 1 p.m., we're going to be having another session on safety and candidacy. At 2 p.m. until 3:30, we're going to be having a panel on interprofessional perspectives on safety and healthcare. And then finally, we will end with a conversation about safety and advocacy. So this is our first safety conference, so incredibly excited. Safety is everyone's responsibility. So fundamentally, that is something that we all share. And we need to be focused on this. This is something that impacts each and every one of us and our own practice, not only the people we're serving, not only the community that we're sharing, but ourselves as well. Did you know that according to the Canadian Mental Health Association, 70% of Canadian employees are concerned about the psychological health and safety of their workplace? So when we think of safety, a lot of times we think of physical safety, but today I'm going to be talking about safety in a much broader concept, because the notion of parceling or labeling or saying there's physical safety, emotional safety, this kind of safety, that all different kinds of factors contribute to safety. And this is an issue that matters on multiple levels. It has implications from a financial level, it has implications from an ethical level, and just simply in terms of our own conscious and well-being. And so it's a really important concept, and we're therefore dedicating this whole day towards beginning to have a conversation where safety is our top priority with other professionals as well, as we continue our continued advocacy on this process. So I put this because I wanted to begin with a little bit of a laugh, but also a little bit of a recognition of the ways in which when we mess up, it's not intentional. And that's really the first thing that I wanted to talk about when I talked about this concept. It is a much more complicated conversation, but this video will...
My name is Teresa, and this time we're going to talk about human performance and the creation of safety culture. And I'd like to tell you a story. It's a story about balancing risk and the impact on culture. We were in the last stages of a project that had dragged on in one form or another for several years. We were near the end, with the final commissioning in our sights. We really wanted this project completed, for a few reasons. First, it closed out a major process safety risk, and we were anxious to be operating with an inherently safer design. Secondly, it was almost the end of the year, and if we didn't spend the capital funding before year end, the funding would disappear. It was November, and everyone was feeling the crunch to get this project buttoned up before Christmas. Let's stop here and talk about what creates safety culture. First, there's the design of our equipment. In this case, the old design had been recognized as not being as safe as it could be, and we were upgrading it. We were spending money to make our site safer, an important act that supported our messaging about safety. The project was also very complex. Retrofitting a new part into an old site is never straightforward. This meant it required extra focus to ensure we could apply the right level of quality and thoroughness. At the same time, there was a real push to get the work done. Time pressure is one of the main things that pushes us to the efficiency end of the efficiency thoroughness spectrum. Time pressure comes from a lot of places. It can come from supervisors who imply it would be good to get this done this shift. But more critically, it also comes from our internal clock. In the case of this project, everyone knew we'd be working Christmas if we didn't get this to a state where we could leave it for the holiday. Our site had a strong intervention culture, with good practices around stopping the job if there was any hint that safety was at risk. Nevertheless, I suspect the expectation on finishing the work probably made it a little harder to stop. And peers who also wanted to be done before the Christmas break may have reinforced this. Another part that creates safety culture is rules, but I want to highlight rules are not enough to make a workplace safe. Culture comes to bear in the choices we make. Every choice has every part of the picture coming together in split-second decisions. We demonstrated a commitment to safety by removing the design risk and by listening to workers when they showed us the reality that the timeline couldn't be met without more resources. Talking to frontline workers to find out what's really happening at the interface of design, task complexity, tools, rules, and expectations is where we really learn how we can help create a safety culture. We often say that frontline supervisors, managers, and leaders are responsible for the creation of a safety culture. We focus on who creates or removes risks. I think this is true with one important add. We need to ask our workers and ourselves, what is responsible for the creation of risk? No person can truly change a culture without changing what feeds into that culture. So if you're looking to make a real change in safety culture at your place of work, draw yourself a picture and ask, what is responsible for the creation of risk in this picture? And change it.
All right, that video is a great introduction to this concept of safety. A lot of times when we talk about safety, we talk about it like it's human error. But the truth is that it's a much broader culture, and there's so many other factors that are going into it. Here are a couple of, just to help us get started, since it is Friday, a couple of memes or cartoons to talk about the ways in which we usually talk about safety, which is really focused on what people do. And here you can see this guy who's obviously not doing a very safe job in the way he's balancing his arm on a saw. And he's saying something that is something that we can probably all identify and empathize with, which is the impact of time, which was also emphasized in that video. The truth is that all humans make mistakes. The question is, how do we deal with them? Some mistakes are not such a big deal. A typo is not the worst thing in the world. But for those of us who have jobs that impact human life, it is a very scary thing when we make a mistake. So some of you perhaps attended yesterday. We had a special First Voice peer education and support for First Voice experience education. And it was really looking at the ways in which one person's mistake or one person's bias can impact, from as a social worker, for example, or social service provider or healthcare provider, can cause lasting harm to, and not just an individual, but a whole family. And so that's why we have to put this as a top priority. Unfortunately, we live in a culture that is more focused on blaming the worker and punishing the worker rather than looking at the larger safety hazards that is part of the system. And when we blame, one of the problems is that causes shame and guilt, and blame will trigger memories of earlier trauma. And a blaming culture causes us to fear punishment. We are hardwired to hide in order to try to stay safe. And a blaming culture is reinforced by a culture that punishes. Now, colonization, as we know, depends upon the fear of punishment and the blame of the individual. This is one of the hallmarks of a colonial culture. So decolonization requires looking at the system that created it and that maintains it. And in many, many ways, shame and blame contributes to maintaining the culture that actually causes harm and keeps us from feeling safe. So let me explain a little bit about why that is true. Here's another video, because when we think about safety in a social work perspective, it's really part of a larger safety culture. So this video with these cute little dolls are going to help us understand this, but most likely all of us can perhaps relate to aspects of what we are about to see.
It's a typical day in your company's processing plant, and safety seems to be looking good from where you stand. As you walk around the site, checking on the various works, you notice people wearing PPE, procedures are being followed, and teams discussing safety during pre-start meetings. From the outside, it looks like working safely is a priority around here, but your data tells you something very different. At the weekly safety meeting this morning, the ongoing high incident rate remains a cause for concern. Something isn't adding up, and you need to figure out why. Daryl works in the processing plant. He is working with his crew when he looks up and notices two leaders approaching from the main office. This can only mean one thing: they are about to conduct a safety observation. He subtly reaches for his two-way radio. "Ducks on the pond," he says into the radio. I repeat, ducks on the pond. Daryl looks around the worksite and sees a flurry of activity. Everyone is quickly putting on their gloves, addressing any obvious hazards, and ensuring they are following the correct procedures. Ducks on the pond is the known code for leader approaching, and everyone knows exactly what they need to do when they hear it across the two-way. With a work culture like this, there's no wonder the data doesn't match the observed behaviour. The challenge from here is to create a culture where people choose to do their work the safe and correct way because they want to, not because they have to. We call this private compliance. A culture where employees see the benefit in doing things the right and safe way, even when no one is watching. Achieving private compliance is key to unlocking a positive safety culture.
All right, so this video shows the dangers of a negative safety culture. It unfortunately puts the positionality back on the individual. How do you create it so people want to do it? Well, it's really a much broader culture, as I'm going to talk a little bit about. Fundamentally, it's about blame and shame. And we see the ways in which fear of being punished, for example, in that video, causes people to try to hide, try to make sure that they avoid being punished, try to avoid being blamed. The blame and shame dynamic is powerful because each of us are humans, and as humans, we have earlier memories of being shamed, and when we feel blamed, we all have that ability to return to our inner 3-year-old or 5-year-old or 8-year-old or whatever age we were when we had some earlier traumas that caused us to feel shamed and blamed. And so our emotions tend to be impacted by that. And this cycle is a cycle that humans go through, all of us go through. And blame and shame can cause inauthenticity and hiding. We all have experienced, for example, when we feel blamed, someone feels blamed, they might try to apologize in ways that are inauthentic. They might try to hide what's really going on because they don't feel safe. So the whole concept of restorative practices is about building a culture of restorative justice. And when we talk about a safety culture, another word that we're going to talk a little bit later on is a just culture, a culture where we recognize that all of us are human and we're working in a system that is imperfect. And if we can take the blame out of what individuals do and refocus to what are the systemic factors that are contributing and how can we address those systemic factors, then we will have more of a concept of what safety can look like. Because when we are focused on blame and punishment, it tends to trigger shame in people. Of course, this is part of how colonialism, white supremacy, and capitalism works. We see the ways in which a police state builds a culture of fear and trauma amongst different people, and how that can impact a lot of what we're doing. One of the things that we want to be thinking about is the ways in which we live in a system that was built by colonial design, right? So when we think of colonization, we have to recognize all of the factors that contribute to colonial trauma. So when we began with a land acknowledgement and talked about our commitment to truth and reconciliation, we think of all of the systems, the government systems, whether it's child welfare, whether it's other government systems, whether it's policing, that contribute to this blame and shame and fear of punishment. I'm going to just take a second for a small little, here we go. And now when we think of all of those different components of the culture within which we live and the ways in which that builds and perpetuates a blame and shame culture, what we want to be focused on is our mandate for truth and reconciliation. And there are specific calls to action when it comes to health, when it comes to child welfare, as well as education, and when it comes to justice. And so when we talk about safety, we have to recognize the larger system within which we work and the ways in which that culture has built in a fear of getting caught. And the blame and the shame is part of a larger culture that maintains the status quo, as we saw, where the ducks on the pond was the code word so that everyone would hide and pretend to be doing what they wanted, because knew they were supposed to be doing, because they were afraid of getting caught. But the system, as we saw in the earlier video, whether it's because of time crunch, whether it's because of all of us being overwhelmed, means that a lot of us feel like all of the things on our to-do list is impossible to do. And we often will sacrifice quality for the efficiency component. So when we talk about decolonizing, we recognize that this is a treaty responsibility, but it's also a pathway towards a safer Mi'kma'ki for everyone. And when we think about it, we recognize that one of the things that's part of decolonizing is looking at discipline that is not shame-based, but that is more focused on moving forward with love, which is how Dr. Marie Baptiste talks about it. When we think about deconstructing Eurocentric colonialism. And when we think of colonization, we think of the ways in which these values contribute to a police state, contribute to people being afraid, and contribute to all of that shame. There's a collective trauma that is shaping our culture. And that is part of what we have to be thinking about when we're thinking about colonization. Now, I read this at the very beginning, but decolonizing ourselves in our practice means recognizing the ways in which we are each impacted by the colonial system in which we all participate, and from which those of us of settler descent continue to benefit. These false silos between us of different labels and different identities cause us to sometimes miss out on the fact that there is a center of power that is continuing to benefit from all of us being turned against one another in terms of lateral violence, the ways in which we turn on one another, competing for crumbs of attention, crumbs of safety, crumbs of recognition, financial reward, power, really safety in a world that is increasingly unsafe. And even looking at the ways in which the housing crisis, the lack of affordability is causing more of us to feel dependent on our jobs, to feel safe, which means that it's harder to speak up when we see things that are unsafe. And that contributes to some of the maintenance of this shame that we all carry. And we carry this not just as individuals, but we've all inherited this system. It existed before any of us was born, and all of us have different types of trauma that are impacted, because intergenerational trauma looks different for different people, but trauma has similar characteristics for all human beings. Most of us have inherited intergenerational trauma, and policies that blame and shame us tend to have similar effects on us and tend to activate earlier traumas that are built into us. So Healing, which is of course what social workers and healthcare providers are committed to do, social service providers are committed to do. Healing requires people to feel safe. And the first step is, how can we as providers feel safe in the way we're trying to provide services for the people for whom we're caring? It's hard because when we feel blamed, we go into a shame place and it gets activated into memories of trauma. And all of us have had earlier traumas. All of us, for example, experienced a moment in our childhood where we felt shamed, where we had trauma. And that early trauma gets activated when we feel shamed or blamed in a later context as an adult. All of us, if people look at us and they maybe are judging us, we go into that early place. And it's not just an early place for ourselves, but it has intergenerational components to it, because we have intergenerational and systemically reinforced trauma. And so when we think of a blame culture that causes shame, that has the fear of punishment and survival fears, right? Because I'm worried about, how am I going to pay rent? How am I going to pay my mortgage? How am I going to pay my student loans? I went to school and now I've got all of these loans and I'm trapped in a system that is causing harm, and I see it, but I don't know what to do about it because I feel trapped, because I have to continue to make ends meet because I'm supporting my family. That causes survival guilt and fear that makes us complicit to a system that punishes us often if we speak out, our squeaky wheel, are loud. And so all of us, because of our intergenerational trauma, because of our early childhood trauma, have unique responses. So a lot of us know fight or flight as a trauma response. Fight is where we respond in anger. Flight is where we escape. But there's also flop, where we simply just give up. Fawn, where we identify with the oppressor and we try to please and we repress ourselves. Or freeze, where we dissociate and numb ourselves, shut down. This is compassion fatigue. This is burnout. This is moral distress. Moral, and all of these are part of how we are wired to react in these ways. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but unfortunately, we're taught shame, and shame is reinforced by a lot of our colonial policies that punish individuals instead of looking at the larger systems that create the process. But there are structural factors. And when we talk about colonization, we're talking about colonial trauma that is reinforced, reenacted across generations. This existed before any of us were born. All of us, and in fact, the people who arrived even as colonial settlers on Turtle Island were themselves running away from something else. And the trauma was reenacted from one generation to a next to a next. And it has certain characteristics. And one of them is that blame and that shame. And we internalize these beliefs through trauma. And that is part of what we need to be thinking about when we talk about building a safety culture. What does safety look like? It begins with, how can we feel safe? And it begins with recognizing the components of intergenerational trauma, the ways in which these thoughts and feelings can cause us to have difficulty focusing. And we know that when we are spending all of our time telling ourselves, I'm incompetent, I'm worthless, I'm to blame, I'm unlovable, it's my fault, I'm stupid, that brings up early childhood responses that have intergenerational components, and it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. Because the more I feel bad about the self, the harder it is to be present and focus and connect with the person in front of us, because we have so much that's going on inside of us when we're afraid of being punished. So when we talk about blaming the worker, we are reinforcing that dynamic, which actually makes us less safe. We've all inherited a system that causes harm. And when our safety efforts are focused on people instead of fixing the system, then we are actually inadvertently causing more harm. But the reality is that this is a system that was built by bias, and it is maintained by bias. It's maintained by blame culture that causes shame culture that keeps us feeling unsafe, all of us, and feeling like we have to hide from one another because I'm afraid that this person's going to report on me. And that is a policing culture that causes us to hide and increases shame. Our system has hurt each of us in unique ways, and it continues to hurt each of us in unique ways. And yet, we are blaming ourselves for this. When I talk about decolonization, often I hear people say, stop talking about it, it makes us feel bad. But the reality is we're all impacted by it. We all inherited it. None of us created it. We're all carrying intergenerational trauma inside of us. Our life experiences and the things we were taught causes us harm, and it causes us to harm others. Our continued participation in the system means we are causing harm. So we have to look at this from a harm reduction approach. And we have to recognize that the first step is to stop this blame of people culture and rather look at the system that we've inherited and say, what are the patterns? What is going on and how can we fix the system? We have to change the system. When we blame people, we're making things worse, but we're all human. We all make mistakes, and blame causes this trauma that causes us to stay safe. And if we can look at the system that created it and permitted the mistake, we can help people feel safer. Sometimes harm happens on purpose, but sometimes it happens by accident. And when we feel safe, we can talk about, look at this mistake, and then we can try to fix it. And I'm focusing on this because I've heard some social workers and I've heard some healthcare providers and I've heard some doctors and nurses say that they have observed in our hospitals right here in Mi'kma'ki, in our Nova Scotia hospitals, they've observed doctors say, I've seen them say, and I've seen this also in the States when I worked in hospitals there, mistakes happen, and instead of just documenting what happened, okay, what's the version that we're going to put down in the documentation records? That is a very unsafe event, but it didn't happen by accident. It happened because they were scared to talk about what really happened and talk about it. So looking at this blaming culture, we have to recognize the larger components. There are methods of talking about how to avoid adverse events. We started to talk about it. It became part of a collective conversation during the pandemic, where we looked at, for example, the Swiss cheese model as a way of protecting social distancing and wearing masks and washing hands and rapid testing was a method that we looked at to try to prevent harm. But harm happens not just in terms of the germ of COVID-19 and not just in terms of a physical safety incident, but it happens in terms of how we talk about safety on issues of microaggressions, the ways we've internalized things, the ways in which, for example, I often get misgendered. I go by he, they pronouns. People will often use the she pronoun. That causes me harm. It hurts me. But I recognize that it also sometimes is intentional, but often it's not intentional. It's because people are unlearning the fact that they used to know me with one pronoun and they're having to learn me. There are methods of making that safe. For example, oh, I know someone who's transitioning. I'm going to practice telling my favorite stories of that person with their new pronoun. Hey, would you be my practice buddy? I want to show respect. I know that I have to unlearn my habit in my brain so that I can do it better. That's an example. But there are many habits that we have learned. There are many words that we have learned that cause harm. For example, when we say certain words like, let's have a powwow instead of a meeting, maybe someone has said that and not recognizing the ways in which a lot of the words that we use are reflective of a colonial bias, right? Our language that we've learned maintains certain beliefs. And so recognizing the harm of what we can do is one way that we can begin to make it safer for everyone. We work in healthcare, we work in social services. What if every system that dealt with human lives had the same safety and engineering principles that it ensures safer air travel? What can we learn from engineering and safety that we could apply to child welfare, for example, to social services? What if we look at the safety culture and what is part of that? It involves, for example, a transparent reporting culture, a teamwork culture. I'm going to talk a little more about what is involved in this, but it has engineering principles to look at how do we hardwire healthy, safer behaviors into the structure to make it easier for humans that are imperfect to do safer work. So there are engineering controls in the systems, in the policies, in the structure on a macro level. Then there are mezzo components in terms of administrative controls. And then there's behavioral controls, things that we do, our professional standards, our ethics. And then sometimes harm might still happen. What can we learn about how and why that harm happened? It happened because all of those controls that were put into place are imperfect because they were designed by humans. And so after there's harm, instead of hiding it, we have to learn from it. This is what's called post-incident mitigation. This is about how can we work to create a safer place for all of us to work in. So a culture of blame focuses on blaming people, looking at what's wrong. It's pathologizing, right? When we talk about focused on building resilience, focused on what's working well, part of this is this culture of shifting from blaming to a shared culture where we're all partnering and creating an environment where we all feel safe to co-create a safer environment. And it involves saying, hey, I made a mistake. Let's look at it. Let's figure it out together. Where, why, how, and let's together work on coming up with a solution that will make it safer for everyone. It involves learning from mistakes, feeling safe, trusting. It also has cross-functional cooperation, intercollaborative collaboration, as opposed to what we see on the shame and blame side on the left, where we see distrust, finger pointing, hiding problems, hoarding decision-making authority. Let me ask my supervisor, making assumptions, being risk adverse. I'm afraid to do anything wrong because I might get punished, waiting until told. And that contributes to a lack of innovation and creativity when we really want to be creating. First of all, because it's generating and it helps us feel better. It brings our own spirit into it, but it also helps maybe create something that will help save more people. So decolonizing involves looking at safety in terms of the values. Perfectionism is a strategy that is part of a culture that causes shame and complicity, a sense of urgency, defensiveness, focusing on quantity over quality, worshiping the written word and policy, believing there's only one right way of doing it, paternalism, either or binary things. You either did it this way or you're punished. Power hoarding, fear of open conflict, this idea only I can do this, individualism, silos, only me, I'm the only one. Keep doing more and more and more. This productivity, capitalism, urgency, this idea that objectivity is possible. Objectivity is not possible. We're all human. The systems we are working in were created by humans, maintained by humans. They are imperfect. We all are subjective. Part of making it safer is looking at our unique subjectivity, our unique positionality, and recognizing that we can do better, but it involves recognizing these values and how they impact us, how they're built into everything. That is part of what creates shame and complicity and hiding and maintains the status quo. So decolonizing is recognizing that the system we inherited is to blame, and recognizing that shame is actually contributing to the problem. When we feel shamed, that's a sign to be like, what's going on? How can we make this safer for everyone? So safety culture, and there's a lot of, we're going to get to hear from doctors later about, and engineers later this afternoon about safety culture, but it has certain characteristics. It has a learning just culture. A just culture is in an atmosphere of trust in which people are encouraged or rewarded for providing safety information. Like, here's a mistake, here's something that could go wrong. And instead of being a squeaky wheel, they're rewarded. It's a learning culture where we're excited to keep learning from our mistakes. It's a reporting culture, not reporting to blame, but hey, I have two people who are on my floor. They both have the same last name. This is a possible safety concern. How are we going to work it together? We sometimes do that on a safety level, but do we do it with, here's a person that has an intersectional identity where they have multiple intergenerational traumatic possibilities that could cause them to experience bias. So for example, we heard yesterday from someone who has a progressive neurological disease and whose children were taken away from her because they assumed that she was drunk. And in fact, when she also happens to be transgender. And so at first she was presenting as male, and they made an assumption. And when she talked about being transgender, suddenly people started to think about their assumptions differently. And what she actually has shared is that that was actually one of the factors that helped people rethink that. So that's an example of learning from what happened from people who've experienced harm, who've experienced bias, so that we can see the unique permutations and combinations of our bias, and then learning from adverse events and errors to make it safer for everyone. We make mistakes. Perfectionism keeps us locked and trapped and afraid to talk about our mistakes and learn from them. But a safety culture involves celebrating mistakes as opportunities to learn how to do better and be better. And that means we have to be entering into what engineers talk about as the continuous improvement cycle. I had an opportunity to be trained in lean process improvement. Lean process improvement is a methodology that looks at hardwiring the system. Now, sometimes it gets used in ways that are cost-cutting, but that's not its intention. That's not how it was designed. It has principles of creating a safer culture that actually involve getting first-person voices to be part of the redesign of our system, which is what we are advocating for. We want to make sure that people who are living with the consequences of our policies are part of the redesign, because we know that the system has not yet been perfect, or we wouldn't have the outcomes that we have. We're all human. None of us see the whole picture. And those of us that think differently and look at things differently are the ones that are beginning to see possible improvements. But all of us are asking around, and none of us are asking the person. We aren't person-centered yet, right? This famous cartoon that you've all seen probably, no one's asking the elephant, who are you? And listening to their voice. All of them are like, oh, I know what I was told, and we have tunnel vision based upon what we were told, and our education system causes us to think that, for example, psychological health and physical health are somehow different. They are not different. People, for example, who get a heart attack are more likely to have heart disease, in addition to heart disease, they're more likely as a consequence to have anxiety and depression and severe mental health consequences. It's the way the body is wired. The body is wired so that the body and mind and heart and spirit and the larger environment within we live and work are interactive. But we don't have, as standard procedure, when someone gets a heart attack, we don't say, hey, you're very likely over the next couple of months to have mental health challenges. Here, as part of your follow-up, is a mental health counselor, is resources to help you. No, instead, what we do is we blame them for having had too many fast food that they ate because they couldn't, they were working 12 jobs and trying to do, so we blame the patient instead of saying, this is part of a larger whole, and you're going to have not just physical, but other factors. But we have this siloed approach to the way we do things. And we live in a colonized system that is governed by intersectional hatred, protected by a system that thrives on punishment, blame, shame, and perfectionism. Silos and fragmentation are strategies of colonizing to divide and conquer and keep us from seeing the full picture. So, for example, with child welfare, we see who is doing the assessment, who is doing the intervention. There's so many different steps. How many cross-departmental conversations exist? How do we make sure that everyone is part of recognizing that we all have unique perspectives that could contribute to a larger whole? A safety huddle, for example, is a method that is used in hospitals and in other systems. For example, if we looked at other engineering systems, how can we learn from the way air travel is working to ensure safety? How can we learn from that? How can we learn from these principles? Well, one principle is a safety huddle, and it's a method of bringing together different voices and disciplines to see what needs to be fixed, to see how we can learn together. That's why we're looking at interprofessional learning and collaboration. That's why we have communities of practice, because that improves communication and it helps us catch. The reason we were able to begin our advocacy for transgender children, for example, is because of an interprofessional peer supervision group that is organized by Dr. Zink from IWK, who's a psychiatrist. And there were endocrinologists, pediatricians, psychologists, social workers, so many different healthcare providers gathering together once a month to look at gender affirming care. And we noticed doctors were saying, hey, I'm noticing this. Children aren't able to go to the bathroom. Others are saying, I'm noticing this. And others said, oh, I'm noticing this too. Then we see the pattern. And what was one of the patterns? There are gender diverse bathrooms in many schools, but they were locked because well-meaning people who didn't have first voice perspective, there wasn't a first voice perspective at the decision-making table, thought that they were protecting children by locking those bathrooms. And because they thought that the bathrooms were being used for smoking. Well, if smoking is your priority, then that's what you're going to be focused on. You don't know what it's like, but then here's a doctor, an endocrinologist saying, I'm noticing that all of the children I'm working with are not able to go to the bathroom all day long, and it's causing physical health problems. And that was the beginning of sharing information that led to our interprofessional letter to the Department of Health and the Department of Education and the Department of Community Services, and asking for a child and youth advocate for the rights of children, for first voice to be included, for updated guidelines. Why did we do all that? We did all that because all of those disciplines came together. And it's not just the Department of Education that needs to fix this. It has implications across many silos of government. This is what it means to be a social worker, right? We recognize that we are part of a larger whole. We need each other. This is part of ecological systems theory. This is part of recognizing that you can't look at the individual without looking at the larger systems within which we function and exist. And this is part of who is centered, whose voice is centered. So when I talk about decolonizing safety, it means many things. It means recognizing the harm of our system and our part in it. And it means removing false silos that keep us apart from each other, and lateral violence that maintains those silos, prejudice that maintains those silos, competing for resources that maintains those silos. And it means getting away from the mindset that keeps it going, which is the blame and shame culture. It means shifting to a trauma-informed, patient-first perspective and letting those with lived experiences teach us. And it means learning from our mistakes. It means accountability, transparency. It means celebrating mistakes, near misses, good catches, catching a possible error, a possible safety concern early before it causes harm. This is part of changing the culture within which we look, recognizing that we all can learn from our mistakes. It's part of being human, and it's part of how we can learn and grow and do better. And this is what a just culture means. Patient safety culture is maintained by a just culture, where we look at all of the different perspectives, where we flatten hierarchies and listen to everyone's voice. A safety culture should have the president of the hospital, the person cleaning the floors, the social worker, the nurse, every single person is equal, has a unique perspective. We have to be welcoming challenges, championing innovation, trying to learn, and being kind with one another, which involves feeling safe. If we're traumatized, we don't feel safe, right? So it all comes back to that emotional safety to translate into physical safety. And it involves unlearning all of the biases that we've all inherited and that are maintained by the systems within which we learn, because I will never know what it's like to be anyone other than me. And no one will ever know what it's ever like to be anything other than themselves. That's why we have to learn from everyone. And that's how we build a safety culture. And the first step of everything is, as Dr. Michael Yellowbird talks about, we have to decolonize the mind. That is the first step towards safer care for all.